Hello, guys. So, this is going to be a fictional story. This is a creepypasta fan fiction written by me that I wrote as a sequel to Josh Parker's famous creepypasta, The House That Death Forgot. I've already written a prequel to this story, The House That Death Forgot, and this is the sequel. So I hope you guys enjoy. I did this because I really wanted to, and also because a viewer requested it. So yeah, I hope you enjoy The House That Undeath Forgot. My name is Persephone. I was fired from my job and didn't know what I was going to do, as many stories like this one start out. I like to distract myself with my true crime podcast while sifting through job listings, and one case stood out to me because of its unusual nature, and also because it involved events that happened near my town. The case also interested me because it was still active, and a sizable reward was offered to anyone who could help solve it. After thinking it over, I decided to do some amateur investigating, see if I could turn my luck around and achieve a good deed in the process. The case involved one Melinda Orton, a 31-year-old woman who mysteriously disappeared one night only 3 months ago. What made the case unusual is that in 3 months, police hadn't found any trace of Melinda and weren't able to gather any leads. The only hint they had was the fact that Melinda's father, Rob Orton, had also disappeared years before his daughter did. Naturally, the news stories didn't publish Melinda's address, but they did give the name of where Rob had lived, a ratty little apartment complex called Ridge Sky Place that was about a 2 hours drive away. I decided I'd start my investigation there. Ridge Sky was a dump, plain and simple. It resembled a campground more than an apartment complex, with the units practically crumbling and the tenants looking gloomy or suspicious of my presence. Driving around, I didn't see anything of particular interest, but then I caught sight of something that made me uneasy. The expression, the writing on the wall, made literal. Ol' Uncle Quarrel got Melinda. That's what was written on the side of Building 4, a building tucked in the back that faced the woods. The message was in sloppy spray paint that was still wet. An insensitive prank by someone who knew Melinda's father once lived here? Or a confession? It was hard to say. I left Ridge Sky and decided to simply explore what lay ahead on the long stretch of road past the apartments, purposely missing the exit ramp that would get me back to the main highway and civilization. If I was lucky, I'd find something that could point me to Melinda, and if nothing promising caught my eye, I could simply turn around. It was a happy, sunny day, and I honestly decided to make a little vacation out of my investigating, odd as it may sound. I remember blaring the bloodiest episodes of my true crime podcast while I sailed down the road. I saw nothing but woods for miles, but was undeterred. I still had over half a tank of gas. I could afford to go on a little longer. But then, after probably multiple hours, I remember I listened to at least 3 podcast episodes, and lost track of time getting lost in them. My eye spotted something conspicuous on the side of the road. A square wooden sign, the only sign I'd seen for miles. I slowed down to read it. Granny Royce's Roadhouse. Come stay the night at Granny's. She'll take good care of you. Room, board, low prices, next exit. Interesting. Maybe Granny Royce had seen Melinda. It was certainly worth a shot. I decided to make a stop there. Granny Royce's Roadhouse lay at the end of a long dirt driveway surrounded by trees. It was a bit hard to tell where to turn in, but I managed all right. I couldn't help but smile when I spotted the house. It was peaceful and quaint. It looked like the type of house you might see on the box of a mystery board game, with that classic haunted charm about it. I briefly considered staying the night just for the heck of it. It was my kind of place. Exiting my car, I approached the house's little wooden porch. The little clearing where the house was set was serene, to be sure, but was eerily silent. Silent except for the crunch of leaves and twigs under my feet. One couldn't help but feel that something was hidden behind the trees, waiting and watching. I pushed open the door to Granny Royce's Roadhouse and was greeted by a foyer with chairs and some magazines set out. This was where I was to check in, it seemed. I grinned and approached the front desk. From a back room, someone stepped out to greet me. I was taken aback, not because the woman who came to greet me was wearing an eye patch, a homemade one sewn from cloth by the looks of it, and not even because she looked mortified to see me. It was the fact that she probably wasn't Granny Royce that had me startled. She looked far too young to be a granny. She seemed to be my age, around 30, with dark hair and a pale face. "Oh," I greeted the woman. "Is this where I check in, or—" The woman continued to stare at me, her expression incredulous and amazed. She breathed heavily. Then it hit me. A frankly ridiculous idea, but one I was sure of. I smiled broadly and started to approach the woman, convinced I knew exactly who she was, crazy as it seemed. I pointed at her. She recoiled. "You're Melinda!" I cried triumphantly. "Oh my God, you are Melinda, aren't you? Melinda Orton?" The woman blinked. Her mouth fell open. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an exit. I, she stammered. "How did you know who I was?" she demanded, frightened. She continued to back away from me as I came closer. I tried to calm her. No, you have it all wrong," I assured her. I smiled gently. "My name is Persephone. I've been trying to find you." Melinda frowned at this. She finally seemed convinced I meant no harm. "Find me?" she asked. "Well, sure," I said brightly. "You've been missing a little while now." She seemed offended. "Well, I imagine you already knew that," I said awkwardly. Melinda said next, "Listen, you need to leave." Before I could say anything in protest, 2 more people entered the foyer from the back room, an elderly woman and a young man. The elderly woman, evidently Granny Royce, had a polite enough face on, whereas the young man looked beleaguered and filled with dread, like he'd just seen the first flash of lightning in what promised to be a powerful storm. He took his pork pie hat off his head and gripped it nervously. "Melinda, dear," Granny Royce said. Melinda didn't take her eye off me. "You didn't tell me we had a new guest." "We don't," Melinda said hotly. "She was just leaving." Granny gave Melinda a disapproving look before coming forward to greet me. The young guy crossed his arms and lingered in the background. "I apologize for Melinda, dear," she said. She lowered her voice and informed me. "She was lost when she came here for help, you see. But there was an accident that prevented her from leaving, and she's not been happy about it." "You can say that again," the young man mumbled with a scoff, and Melinda shot him a fierce look. He put his hat back on, securing it firmly in place. "An accident?" I couldn't help but ask, looking up at Melinda. She turned her back at me, as if ashamed. She looked like she might cry. I started to apologize, but then the young man stepped forward. "Never you mind, miss. Melinda doesn't like to talk about it, but I'll sum it up for you. Car wouldn't start when she tried to leave here. Then I had the displeasure of informing her we unfortunately haven't got a phone. Old place, you know. Then she became a little antsy and tried to hightail it, but wound up in a spot of trouble. She asked to stay with us for a while. Poor thing doesn't have any family that care about her. That's all it is." He turned to Melinda, and with an emotionless tone and impassive face he asked her, Isn't that right, Melinda? Melinda, now looking more angry than upset, said nothing for a moment. She glanced at me almost hatefully, and then nodded at the young man to affirm he was telling the truth. But I knew better. Your car broke down, Melinda, I asked. But Melinda merely scowled at me, looked at me like I was a moron. Why, dear, Granny Royce said gently, giving me a confused look. Her car's right outside. Didn't you see? The tires were they've since popped. The car's still out there in the yard. Been there since Melinda came to us. I frowned. I said, I didn't see any cars out there, actually. Everyone's face suddenly whitened with fright. If these were kidnappers who had abducted Melinda, like I suspected, they certainly weren't good ones. Did they really think they could lie that Melinda had car troubles when there wasn't any car out there except mine? Miss, the young man said hoarsely, maybe you should go. Now. He didn't sound angry. For some reason, he sounded scared shitless. Maybe I should, I said, finding as brave a voice as I could, but I'm taking Melinda with me. To my surprise, no one said anything. Melinda seemed hesitant and worried, as did the others. She turned to Granny, as if asking her what she should say. Granny sighed, glancing at me and then back at Melinda. It's like Calvin said when you first arrived, dear, she said gloomily, clasping her hands together. There's no guarantee you'd be safe, even if it's light out. Wait, I said. Everyone's eyes in the room turned to me. I pointed at who I presumed was Calvin. You weren't trying to keep her here? No, Calvin assured me, shaking his head. Gee willikers, miss, no indeed. We're not trying to keep anyone prisoner here. He's telling the truth, said Melinda, and she sounded like she was telling the truth herself. She briefly turned to Granny, who wordlessly nudged her to go on. There's a reason we can't leave, and honestly, it would probably be best if you stayed. There's no guarantee you can make a run for it safely. I squinted in confusion. I could see Granny and Calvin lying about imaginary dangers outside, especially if they had secret nefarious plans. But why was Melinda herself telling me all this? Stockholm Syndrome? He was motioning for me to join him and the others in the back room. He could see I wasn't budging. Seeming to get an idea, he disappeared into the kitchen and reappeared with a butcher's knife. Immediately, I reached for my pepper spray, but then he placed the knife in my hand. Feel free to use that if you need to, Calvin said seriously. But trust me, we're on your side. I was bewildered. Granny, Melinda, and Calvin, I had to admit, all appeared to be acting genuinely. I nearly agreed to sit with them, but then Calvin, probably because of an honest mistake from lacking modern sensibilities, put his arm around me. Come now, miss, let's go, and I roared, back off, creep, and plunged my knife into his gut. He didn't react. Neither did anyone else. Calvin was completely uninjured, or at least it seemed. Can't kill a dead man, miss, he said matter-of-factly. How about let's talk? So let me get this straight. I said as soon as Granny, Melinda, and Calvin had finished taking turns, relating the story of how Melinda came to the Roadhouse. I had to stifle my laughter. You drove around 5 hours total, mostly in the wrong direction, and you never once decided to turn around? Melinda didn't think it very amusing. I did! Once I got here, I sure as hell did. But why not turn around earlier? Honey, Granny broke in, people don't always think clearly, especially if they're angry or frightened or confused, all of which Melinda was that dreadful night. At this point, it doesn't matter anyway. This house has ways of drawing people to it, or rather, he has ways of drawing people to this house to keep them here. Yeah, Melinda shouted at me defensively, and it looks like you fell for it too. Not so smart yourself, are you? I'm sorry, I told Melinda sincerely. She still scowled at me. After a moment, I looked around the table where we all sat. Calvin was sipping his tea, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Granny had her hands folded and resting on the table, head bowed as though in prayer. Melinda showed no signs of stopping hating me any time soon. I took in the sight of all these undead people, frozen in time, made this way, they said, by the dagger of a mysterious figure who haunted the grounds of the house and who I hadn't yet seen. I pitied them, but also envied them, in a way. I dared to let them know what I thought of the situation. Well, I said, trying to brighten up the room, I know it seems hopeless, but look at it this way. Isn't immortality kind of, I don't know, cool? Melinda's mouth dropped open. She then scoffed, disgusted. Granny and Calvin looked up, confused but perhaps a little intrigued. It is rather cool, as a matter of fact, Calvin said. Ice cold, in fact. You felt my hand when I had it on your shoulder, didn't you? Frankly, I don't blame you for stabbing me. It must have been quite the shock. We'll talk about why I stabbed you later, I said quickly. But anyway, think about it, you guys. Sure, it comes at a price, but this is immortality we're talking about. By sheer luck, you've solved humanity's oldest problem. The undead people all stared at me, dumbstruck. Finally, Calvin said, in a measured voice, Miss Persephone, I know it might seem that way to a healthy young lady like yourself, but trust me, you don't want to live forever. In the state we're in, well, you can't really call it life. It's hell is what it is, Granny said bitterly, her voice shaky. It's not your traditional hell of fire and brimstone, but it is suffering, mind you. Eternal suffering, just like I heard about at church when I used to go with my husband all that time ago. We've often discussed who that menace is out there, Calvin told me. And believe me, Miss Persephone, we've arrived at Old Scratch himself as an answer many a time. Old Scratch? I asked. The devil, Calvin clarified. You know, Satan. Hey, Melinda said, appearing to realize something. Didn't you mention an Old Scratch when you told us why you came here? Or something like that? She was right. I did, I cried. Old Uncle Quarrel, that's what the writing on the side of the building said. That someone called Old Uncle Quarrel got Melinda. Melinda winced. Well, Calvin said, it seems to me that this Uncle Quarrel is the phantom outside keeping us in this hell. Writing a message like that would certainly be in character for him. After all this time, looks like we finally have his name. Even so, Granny Royce said, we still have no way to deal with him. And if you tried to leave, Persephone dear, I dare say he'd make quick work of you, like he did us. Why, evening's beginning to fall, she gestured to the window, and as we all know, that's when it's most dangerous. I rose from my spot at the table to look outside. Granny was right. Dusk was falling. Outside, it was a serene and magical-looking twilight. It is a bit odd we haven't seen anything of Quarrel since Miss Persephone arrived, Calvin whispered to Granny and Melinda. Well, Granny said, he must be about, right? He never leaves. It appears he's finally finished off Miss Melinda's car, hasn't he? Didn't even leave one scrap behind. Same with mine, I told everyone. I had been peering around every tree for my car, but it was all in vain. A wave of dread came over me. Granny Royce's suddenly wasn't such a cool and interesting place anymore. The undead people rushed to the window. Lord love a duck, exclaimed Calvin. It's gone. There was now a mound of dirt in the spot where my car had sat. I watched it, and in the faint twilight I could just make out something that I at first took for a large dancing spider. But then I saw that it was, in fact, a hand protruding out of the earth, violently thrashing back and forth. "Oh my God!" Melinda cried, clasping her hands over her mouth as I continued to stare. I saw Granny and Calvin exchange a look out of the corner of my eye, and in the next moment Calvin was running out of the kitchen and bounding upstairs. "I thought it had been strangely quiet," Granny whispered frightfully. I found Granny's words odd, but then I think I understood what she meant once I began to hear the sound of someone wailing madly outside. Then I saw it. The head and torso, well, what was left of the head and torso, I should say, of a man emerging from the ground, the bottom half of his face missing, one side of his body torn apart with mangled flesh and bone exposed. His face was stained with fresh tears. His eyes, a clear green, shone with unmistakable humanity and begged for help. I must admit I was terrified, at least at first. For one horrible moment, before my eyes met with this poor trapped zombies, I believed I was staring into the face of old Uncle Quarrel himself, not one of his victims. "Mr. Norris's room is empty!" Calvin cried, running back into the kitchen. We all turned to look at him. "He's gone!" "He's out there," Granny screeched, pointing a quivering finger at the window. "The poor fool must have tried to leave again." We all whipped our heads back to the window, but Mr. Norris, as Calvin called him, was nowhere to be seen. The only trace of him was his horrendous crying, which was still audible, though muffled. We saw to our horror that my car had been placed back where it was, with Mr. Norris now directly under it. There was a deafening crash, and the bottom half of the car inexplicably exploded out from under it, effectively crushing Mr. Norris and stamping him into the ground. We couldn't hear his crying anymore. "Dear Lord!" Calvin screamed. Granny began frantically flapping her hands, tears cascading down her cheeks. Oh, someone has to go out there and lift that car off him," she cried wildly. "We can't any of us leave the house, Granny," Calvin shouted. "You know that." "We couldn't even lift that car anyway if we could go out there," cried Melinda. At first I was flummoxed as to why they thought they could save Mr. Norris, but then I realized he was still alive under there and would go on living, smashed beneath my car, forever. The undead people in the room huddled together and hugged one another as they found themselves overcome by tears. I shuffled back over to the kitchen table and silently sat back down. Evening grew into night, and Granny and Calvin had a hard time processing Mr. Norris's demise. Even Melinda, who I was told was scared of Mr. Norris when she first met him, seemed sad at his unthinkable fate. He'll eventually be out of his mind," Calvin suggested as we all sat around the table. "He'll go mad, you see, and he'll stop knowing that he's trapped under there." Granny nodded numbly. She took a handkerchief to dab her tears away. She looked unsure of why she was so upset, but losing Mr. Norris, I imagined, was a bit like losing a family member, especially if she'd lived in the same house with him for so long. Melinda, Calvin, and I allowed Granny to gather herself. We then took a moment of silence for Mr. Norris. "It just doesn't make sense," Calvin said after a while. "He knew better than to go out there." A thought seemed to suddenly come to Melinda. "Wait," she said slowly. "What if he didn't leave? What if someone drug him out there?" She turned to Granny and quickly asked, "Didn't you say someone had gone missing from here? That person I never saw?" "Mr. Standish?" Granny asked. "Yeah," Melinda exclaimed. "Yes, it was right after I came here. You said he'd disappeared." "Oh, yes," Granny said, folding her hands and resting them on the table again. "Yes, right after you became a permanent resident, dear. I found that Mr. Standish had disappeared after I lay you down on your bed." "You don't think this Uncle Quarrel thing got him, do you?" Granny looked away from Melinda. "I've considered it," she said softly. A heavy silence hung over the room. After a while, I decided I'd break it to express one thought that just wouldn't stop nagging me. Does he ever... has Quarrel ever entered the house? I stayed the night at Granny Royce's. Calvin congratulated me for being the first resident who stayed the night while still being alive in, probably 100 years. I was also informed that I was the only one who'd be sleeping. The undead people all found that sleep wasn't any use to them, and they abandoned it entirely, Melinda being the last one to do so. This gave me some comfort knowing I had bodyguards in case old Uncle Quarrel was prowling around, waiting to zombify me. The one guest at Granny Royce's I hadn't met was Miss Tilly, though Granny and Calvin told me about her, and how she came here scared and pregnant, on the run from a New York man she feared would kill her and her baby. Granny explained Miss Tilly liked to stay in her room and spend time with her baby, and she told me it might upset me to meet her without exactly saying why. Calvin periodically checked in on Miss Tilly, telling her of what became of Mr. Norris, and explaining they all had to be extra cautious of the entity we now called Quarrel, who remained elusive. I also overheard him telling her the house had a new guest, me, but that it might be best for her not to come near me, considering, as Calvin said, you can't exactly pass the way Granny and I can. But the unabashed Miss Tilly didn't heed his advice. I had my door cracked, getting ready for the night as best I could without toiletries or nightwear. I saw her eye peeking in at me. "Miss Tilly," I asked, "that you?" She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice was ethereal, soothing. "May I come in?" "Of course," I told her brightly, and she stepped shyly into the room. She was clad in only a bra and a pair of panties, and immediately I saw why Granny and Calvin believed I wouldn't want to see her. I have to admit I gave a small gasp when I saw that her baby, alive, quote-unquote, rested in her eviscerated stomach. I honestly wasn't sure if I needed to say, "I'm so sorry," or what. But I was not disturbed by this eternal pregnancy. In all honesty, I found it oddly beautiful, in a grotesque sort of way. "Jenny," Miss Tilly said, pointing at her baby. I forced myself to smile to be polite, but then my smile became genuine when I met eyes with Jenny. I felt sorry for her. A chunk of her head was missing, and she only had one leg. To make things even sadder, she was covered in lacerations, but her smile was completely intact. "Hi there, Jenny," I said to the baby sweetly. She cooed in response, then giggled. "She likes you," Miss Tilly said. "I like her too," I said, looking up at her. Miss Tilly gave me a broad, warm smile. "I'm glad," she said, "because no one else does." When I woke up the next morning, Miss Tilly was gone, but her baby wasn't. Poor, bloody little Jenny was lying on the center of the kitchen table, like a centerpiece for a perverted Halloween party. She was crying, which pained Granny. "I've never known her to cry. Her lot in this twisted life was probably the worst out of all of us, and yet she never cried, not until now." "Quarrel must have made off with Tilly," breathed Calvin, shaking his head in wonder as Granny blew into her handkerchief. "The bastard moved so fast we never saw him." "And now he's left poor Jenny without a mother," sobbed Granny, dabbing at her tear-soaked face. "Oh, God, Calvin, what are we going to do?" There was actually something very specific that needed to be done, apparently. A drop of something I initially thought was blood fell from the ceiling. I heard Melinda whimper. Was that there a second ago?" We all looked up. Old Uncle Quarrel had left a new message in black spray paint. Or hell, perhaps it really was blood. "Old Uncle Quarrel says, 'Put her in you.'" "The fuck does that mean?" I said, wide-eyed. Granny turned to Calvin, her eyes wild with fear and incredulity. "No," she whispered to him sharply. "No, you don't think..." Calvin stared into Granny's eyes with both terror and sadness. Melinda seemed to pick up on what they were thinking. "Oh, God!" she cried. "No! It can't mean..." We all looked back up at the ceiling. There was a fresh message that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Put her in, or I get Persephone." We all froze, as if we expected Coral to appear in the flesh. What kind of sick game was he playing? "He's bluffing," I said confidently, though my voice was unsteady. I pointed at Calvin and commanded, "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do it." Calvin stood dumbly, mouth slightly agape. He shifted his gaze from me to the mangled, crying baby writhing around on the kitchen table. He began to unbutton his shirt. "Oh, God!" Melinda screamed. She began to retch. She turned away, becoming hysterical. I watched in horror as Calvin revealed the gaping wound in his stomach, the one I'd slid a knife into so easily earlier. Inside wriggled his organs, framed by cracked bones and shredded muscles. The exposed wound dripped some blood as he stepped forward toward the table. The color drained from my face. I shook my head as I witnessed the unimaginable. Calvin scooped up little Jenny. She stopped crying and became deathly silent, perhaps relieved to be held, but more likely confused or worried about what was happening. "Granny!" I screeched. "Granny, for the love of God, stop him!" Granny's eyes flickered over to me. She said in a sad but reasonable voice, "It's too late for Jenny, dear. It's been too late for her for a while. But you, if there's even a chance this will spare you..." There was a loud squelching noise and an ear-splitting shriek of terror from baby Jenny. Melinda turned around and began dry heaving. I almost did the same. Calvin was trying to force Jenny into the hole in his stomach, squeezing her between his entrails, but it wasn't working too well. Jenny kept sliding out. "Stop!" Melinda yelled. "For God's sake, stop it, you sick fuck!" But Calvin wouldn't stop. He stared up at me as he continued trying to shove Jenny in. His eyes seemed to plead for me to trust him. Melinda threw her hands into the air. "Granny!" she bellowed. "Do something!" But Granny didn't do anything for a moment. And then she did do something. She ran to the foyer. For a split second, we all thought she was making a break for it, taking her chances outside. But not so. She came back with a spool of thread and a needle. "You'll have to help me, Calvin," she said over Jenny's agonized screaming. "It's a good thing you used to work in textiles." Calvin and Granny got to work. Melinda and I took turns gaping at each other in shock and then looking back at the gruesome scene of the young man and the old woman shoving a baby inside a gaping wound and stitching the wound up as to trap the baby inside. After a while, we couldn't hear Jenny's crying anymore. Maybe she'd accepted her fate. Maybe her voice was gone. Maybe she was choked by Calvin's spleen or pancreas. But one thing was for sure, she wasn't dead. She could never die. Ever. When it was all over, Granny stood shaking and covered in blood. Calvin, however, was perfectly still. He held his now bulging stomach. He looked amazed, but I couldn't tell you why. Perhaps it was because the wound he'd had for decades was closed for the first time. Perhaps it was because he just inserted a live, undead baby into his body, enacting some dark, perverted parody of pregnancy. No one knew what to say. Some time passed. Melinda and I retreated to the admissions area, where we sat for maybe half an hour. She thumbed through the magazines that had been left out, commenting that she always wondered why they looked so new compared to everything else about the house. She said she supposed she'd never know. Mr. Standish brought the magazines, Granny had told her. That's all Melinda knew. They were as mysterious as Mr. Standish's disappearance. I told Melinda I found the magazines boring and said we should talk about something else instead. I told her about how I'd lost my job, not mentioning I was fired. I told her about my interest in true crime, which I could tell she thought was peculiar, though she pretended otherwise. I lied to her that I came looking for her solely because of how interesting I found true crime and missing persons cases, and she smiled at me and said she was glad I found her, though she hated I was now stuck at the house. "Can I see what's under that eye patch?" I asked her. She was very reluctant, but then she removed the cloth from her face to display the bloodied hole and torn flesh where her eye had been. "I think you look beautiful," I told her, "just the way you are." She gave a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Then Calvin and Granny emerged from the kitchen. "We've decided I should go," Calvin announced hoarsely. Neither Melinda nor I much cared if he went or stayed. Frankly, we found it hard to like him after witnessing him commit such a heinous act, even if he believed he was doing it to protect me. The way I saw it, Quarrel meant to kill and zombify me either way. He didn't have to imprison little Jenny. But who knew? Maybe she liked it in there, all safe and warm. It was impossible to say. "You're not afraid of Uncle Quarrel?" I asked Calvin. He shrugged. "The way I see it, I've been afraid of him for far too long." He began to march toward the front door. "Let him hack me to bits with his ridiculous dagger. When I'm bits, maybe there won't be any me left." He put his hand on the knob and added quietly, "And no Jenny left either." He opened the door. He looked over his shoulder and said one last thing to us. "This suffering, this hell, let's see if I can end it, at least for two of us." He then disappeared into the night, not the least bit scared. Granny did nothing for a moment, just stood rooted to the spot, unbelieving that Calvin would really just walk out after all this time. We could clearly detect the pain in her face. She was losing another loved one, the one at the Roadhouse she'd known the very longest, Melinda had informed me. Granny ran out the door. I sprung out of my seat, but Melinda stopped me. "No," she cried. "I won't let you. There's still a chance for you." "I'm willing to risk that chance," I said. "The bastard hasn't shown his face once. He's just a little bitch, Melinda. And even if he does get me, well, it wouldn't be so bad living here with you. At least I'd have a friend. I've never really had one of those before." Melinda stared at me in awe. "I'm going with you," she said. And we both joined Granny Royce outside. She was standing on the porch. Calvin was nowhere to be seen. But someone new was emerging from the woods. Melinda extended her hand to me. I took it. We waited for a fate worse than death. We were sure that old Uncle Quarrel, old Scratch, the devil, whoever the fuck, was on the way. But he wasn't. As the figure came closer, we saw it was an elderly man, heavy-set in a vest and suspenders, and about Granny Royce's height, maybe a little shorter. "Oh, Stephen!" Granny cried with joy. She practically leapt into her husband's arms. "Stephen Royce, you haven't aged a day." The husband and wife embraced. "No, I haven't," Mr. Royce chuckled, "but I've been dead for longer than I can say." "It's no problem, dear," said Granny smoothly, resting her head on her husband's chest, perhaps pretending there was a heartbeat there for her to listen to. "Oh, you haven't changed a bit." "Well, there is one thing that has changed about me, Rose," Mr. Royce informed his wife. "Oh, whatever could that be, dear? Why, you seem just the same to me." "Well, let's just say I learned to stop pinching pennies," Mr. Royce said with a laugh. "If you hadn't been such a penny pincher, we could have given you a nice burial," Granny said a little sternly. "You're right about that," said Mr. Royce with a little guilt in his voice. "Then Undeath wouldn't have had the chance to steal my body before you and young Calvin could bury it." "Undeath?" I asked, stepping forward. Mr. Royce noticed Melinda and me for the first time. "Oh, yes, little missy," he said. "The one who's been haunting this place for so long. He goes by many names, but Undeath is who he is. The opposite of death, you see. The one who makes you undead." "I knew it," Granny cried. "Oh, I just knew that monster was the one who snatched you up from me." "Well, he won't be snatching anyone else up," Mr. Royce said. "At least not around here. He seems to be gone at last, but he'll always be lurking around. He followed me for about a month, torturing me as I tried to make a life among the living." After saying this, Mr. Royce took something out of his shirt pocket, a box of matches. "But I did manage to nab these on my journey back to you, my dear." Granny stared at the matchbox, confused. "What do you have those for, Stephen?" "It's like I said, Rose. I've learned to stop pinching pennies. I've learned to appreciate the little things in life. But you can't fully appreciate life if it never ends." He unbuttoned his vest and his shirt. We saw that the wound Undeath inflicted upon him was in the middle of his chest. Inside, we could see his deflated, unmoving heart, hanging inside of him, baggy and pathetic. Granny's head had rested next to that hole just a moment ago. "I say we end things," he said, buttoning his clothes back up and tucking his shirt in neatly. He struck a match. "Once and for all." Granny looked lost for words. She looked at her Roadhouse, then she looked at Melinda and me. She smiled at us, the smile any grandmother would give her grandchildren when she saw them for the first or final time. "Goodbye, dears," she said. She took her husband's hand, then turned to Melinda. "It sure was swell, Miss Melinda. As swell as it could have been, anyway." And then, looking me straight in the eye, she said, "And good luck, Miss Persephone. It was such a pleasure meeting you." Mr. and Mrs. Royce retired into their roadhouse. We didn't stop them. We bounded down the steps leading up to the porch and turned around to watch the house become almost instantly consumed with flames. I remember my last thought being whether ashes could possibly possess consciousness. I decided they couldn't. No, Mr. and Mrs. Royce were gone now. Gone to oblivion, and finally at peace. Melinda and I watched the house burn for a while, and then she asked me, "What now?" "Are you ready? I mean, are you ready to, I guess, join your friends you made at the Roadhouse?" Melinda thought for a moment. Then she said, No. Even though I'm dead, I still have a lot of life I'd like to live." I smiled. "And I'd be happy to live it with you." We held hands. I guided Melinda out of the woods, and we made our way back to the road. With the smoke from Granny Royce's Roadhouse billowing behind us, we walked down it and onward toward our new lives. The end.